Imagine, for a slow and quiet moment, that all of human history stretches before you like an immense, ancient book, one so thick that its spine bends gently under its own weight, and so old that the very texture of its pages feels like pressed time itself, softened by the countless hands that have turned them across centuries, millennia, and forgotten ages before memory had a name. As you rest your thoughts for a moment, picture yourself opening this book, letting its aged cover fall away with the softest sigh, revealing pages that hold the stories of everyone who came before you. But as you begin to leaf through this great archive of human existence, you notice something curious, something subtle at first, almost unintentional whole sections where the ink thins, where the story's done, quite a line where the paper feels smoother, emptier, quieter. Then the realization begins to settle in. Entire chapters seem to be missing altogether, as if they were gently lifted out, erased not with force, but with time, intention, accident, or silence. Some stories end in mid-breath, mid-sentence, mid-life, as though their narrators simply walked off the edge of history. Others feel soft, trimmed, or carefully reshaped to fit someone else's memory, someone else's truth. And in those empty spaces, those soft, pale absences, you can almost feel the faint resonance of countless forgotten days. Farmers who tended fields no record ever named. Rulers whose lineages crumble into myth because no scribe captured their reigns. Entire cities that rose, flourished, and faded before the ink of civilization touched them. There is a gentle, haunting beauty in these missing pages, a quiet reminder that most of humanity lived beyond the margins of written history, and that within those blank spaces lies a vast, untouched world of lives, once lived as real as our own. Tonight, we are going to step softly into those quiet gaps, into the subtle shadows between the documented and the forgotten, moving slowly and calmly through the eras that slipped from the record, through the stories that were never written down, and through the chapters that time or someone chose not to preserve. This is not a journey of shock or fear, but one of understanding, of gentle curiosity, and of a soothing awareness that even what is lost still whispers to us across the centuries. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, letting the rhythm of your breath become slower and steadier, allow the weight of the present moment to loosen its grip just a little while we drift together into the soft twilight of forgotten history. If you enjoy peaceful explorations like this, slow, contemplative stories about the hidden corners of the human past, feel free to subscribe so you can join us for more quiet journeys like this one. And if it's not too much to ask, I'd allow to know. What time is it where you are? And from which part of the world are you listening tonight? Your presence here adds a gentle warmth to this shared space. There is a quiet kind of loneliness in the study of history, a feeling that settles over you the moment you begin to notice the empty spaces, where stories should be like corridors in an abandoned library, where the dust falls a little too evenly, where the silence feels a little too intentional, and where you begin to wonder whether the gaps in our knowledge are natural fractures of time or the careful work of a hand determined to shape the memory of the world. And as you sit with that thought, letting it stretch across your mind like a lengthening shadow at dusk, you start to understand that history has always been a conversation between what survives and what is made to disappear, and that somewhere between those two states lies the strange, fragile truth of who we once were. When we talk about missing history, people often imagine distant ruins or forgotten civilizations swallowed by sand, but the reality is quieter, more delicate, and far more unsettling. Entire narratives were trimmed, softened, or erased not by the collapse of time, but by deliberate choice. The steady decisions of scribes, rulers, conquerors, archivists, committees, and institutions who believed the world would be cleaner, safer, or more obedient if certain details never reached the future. And so as we begin this journey tonight, drifting gently into the soft haze of a world built from fragments, we start with a question that floats just behind the hum of memory. What happens to a civilization when the version recorded is not the version lived? If you think about the manuscripts that have survived the chronicles, the sacred texts, the royal records, the private letters, you start to notice patterns, and the pattern is almost always shaped by power. In nearly every culture, those who controlled the writing controlled the remembering, and those who controlled the remembering controlled the story. This is why so many ancient documents read not like windows into the past, but like carefully polished mirrors, reflecting only what the powerful wish to see. The heroes are heroic because someone needed them to be. The villains are monstrous because someone decided they should appear that way. The conflicts are simplified because complexity is inconvenient, and the failures are pushed into the margins because legacy demands the illusion of perfection. And hidden behind these curated reflections lies a deeper, quieter archive. The one filled with things that once existed but were dismissed, removed, or quietly replaced. Tonight, as we walk through this first chapter of our exploration, we take a seat in that invisible archive. Imagine a candlelit room deep beneath a monastery or palace shelves stacked with manuscripts that never made it into the official record. Scrolls whose ink has nearly faded from the neglect of sensuous fragments that challenged the clean shapes of the stories we grew up believing. These are the deleted pages, the testimonies of ordinary people, the perspectives of conquered cultures, the alternate versions of events that contradicted political needs. The suppressed accounts of disasters, betrayals, miracles, and failures that reshaped the world but were never allowed to fully surface. And when you sift through them, gently, with the soft movements of someone handling something fragile, you begin to feel the quiet hum of another reality beneath the one we were taught. There are stories of kings who were kinder or crueler than legend allows, stories of communities whose inventions were attributed to others, stories of spiritual movements rewritten for stability, stories of revolutions that began long before the official date carved into stone. There are personal letters that reveal weaknesses in men hailed as flawless, documents that contradict triumphs we still celebrate, testimonies that complicate events we believed were simple. And yet, for most of history, these pieces were not destroyed. They were simply left out, omitted, with a quiet, deliberate elegance that ensured only one narrative reached the surface while the others drifted slowly out of sight. But the thing about truth is that it leaves a residue, a faint outline, like the impression a removed painting leaves on a wall. Even when the words vanish, the shape of what once existed lingers. Scholars feel it when they see sudden gaps in chronicles, when they trace inconsistencies across versions of the same event, when they notice that a certain king appears brave in one text but barely mentioned in another, or when archaeological evidence whispers a different story beneath the stone. And as these clues begin to align, like stars finding their constellation, we realize that history is never deleted cleanly. It merely waits in the dark for someone to listen closely enough to hear its echo. What makes the deleted pages so fascinating is not just the mystery, but the humanity. These lost pieces are not simply political edits or institutional decisions. They are the voices of people who lived real lives, who held hopes and fears, who told stories by firelight or scribbled notes in margins thinking someone someday might read them. They are farmers describing a famine, soldiers recounting the truth behind a battle, scholars challenging doctrines, travelers documenting cultures that no longer exist, women recording experiences rarely acknowledged by official scribes. When these voices return to us, even in fragments, they round out the world in ways that feel heartbreakingly intimate, reminding us that history is not a linear timeline but a vast, interconnected field of perspectives, some bright, some dim, some nearly erased. So as we close this first segment, let your mind settle into the soft comfort of curiosity. That quiet openness that allows you to drift through the shadows and lights of the past without fear, without urgency, simply floating through the understanding that the story of humanity is larger than the parts we have been shown. And as we move forward, deeper into the chapters ahead, we'll explore the forces that shaped these omissions, the institutions that controlled the narrative, the decisions that sculpted collective memory, and the ways the truth, no matter how deeply buried, finds its path back to us in time. And with that, we gently step towards segment 2, a slow descent into the world of councils, empires, and institutions that decided which memories were worthy of survival, and which were quietly set aside, leaving only the faintest trace in the long corridor of history. There is a quiet moment in every civilization when the story of a people slips from being a living memory held by those who lived it and becomes something bound, curated, and sealed by those who claim the authority to speak for generations. It is in this shift, subtle, deliberate, and deeply human, that the power of memory transforms into something more structured, more controlled, and often more fragile than the chaos from which it was carved. Tonight, as we step into the second segment, we sink deeper into the slow, echoing corridors of the institutions that shaped our understanding of the past. The gatekeepers who stood between lived truth and recorded truth, deciding which stories would survive and which would drift into silence. When people imagine the making of history, they often picture scribes working quietly in candlelit rooms, carefully copying manuscripts with devotion and reverence. But the true shaping of history happened not in those cramped writing rooms, but in the chambers. Just above, the rooms, where decisions were made, where councils gathered, where emperors issued decrees, where scholars debated acceptable narratives, and where the boundaries of truth were gently, sometimes ruthlessly redrawn. Every empire, every religion, every dynasty, every rising power formed its own circle of guardians who believed they were protecting the world by deciding how it would remember itself, and whether those decisions were born from ideology, fear, stability, or ambition. The result was always the same, a version of the past that fit the needs of the present. The earliest examples of this can be found not in violence or censorship, but in the quiet act of selection. Chroniclers writing for kings understood that their survival depended on the tone of their words, and so victories were expanded, defeats softened, and the complexities of human nature simplified into convenient categories. In many cases, the chronicler's pen became an extension of the ruler's will, shaping the memory of events even before the ink had dried. And with each edited line, the identity of nations shifted. Not dramatically, but gradually, like a river rerouted by the placement of a single stone. As centuries passed, this practice became more refined. Empires learned that to control the present, they must first control the narrative of the past. Libraries were curated, archives reorganized, contradictory manuscripts quietly removed or reinterpreted. Councils across the ancient world met not only to guide doctrine or governance, but to define which histories were acceptable, which stories aligned with the identity they sought to build. In this way, historical memory became an instrument, not of deception, but of construction, shaping societies by shaping their origins, their heroes, their failures, and their triumphs. It is tempting to imagine that this shaping was always done with malicious intent, but the truth is softer, more human. Many guardians of memory believed sincerely that they were protecting the world from confusion or chaos. If a narrative threatened stability, it was softened. If a detail challenged unity, it was removed. If a version of events conflicted with the values of an age, it was quietly And in that delicate balance between truth and usefulness, entire cultures found themselves guided by stories smoothed into symbols, simplified into lessons, refined into myth. But even within these institutions, even among the most careful architects of official history, there were moments when the truth slipped through the cracks, in the margins of in private letters, in hidden diaries, in travelogues, written by those with no stake in political narratives. These fragments, unfiltered and unguarded, reveal a world far more complex than the official version. A world filled with contradictions, unexpected alliances, forbidden philosophies, forgotten rebellions, and cultural exchanges that never appeared in the clean lines of institutional records. Imagine a council in an ancient capital, debating not only doctrine but the framing of historical events. Imagine scribes instructed to copy certain texts and ignore others. Imagine emperors issuing decrees that shaped how the past would be remembered for centuries. Decisions repeated across continents and eras formed the skeleton of official history. A structure built with intention, reinforced with authority, and carried forward by tradition. Yet beneath that structure lies another layer, softer and more elusive. The memories of ordinary people whose voices were too scattered, too fragile, or too dangerous to preserve officially. And this perhaps is where the heart of our exploration truly lies, in understanding that the story of humanity is not a single continuous line, but a tapestry woven from countless threads, some bright and celebrated, others dim and nearly lost, and many intentionally pulled from the weave by those who believe the pattern looked better without them. When we recognize this, we begin to understand not only the power of institutions, but also the fragility of truth, and the remarkable resilience of the fragments that survive despite every effort to contain them. As we drift deeper into this soft meditation on memory and control, we start to feel the quiet weight of the past pressing gently, through time, reminding us that the shaping of history is not just an intellectual act, but an emotional one. People shape stories because they care about legacy, about identity, about belief, about the fear of being forgotten or misunderstood. And in this way, the institutions that curated history were not merely bureaucratic forces. They were human, driven by longing, by loyalty, by fear, by pride. Each decision a reflection of the hopes and anxieties of an age. And now, as this second segment comes to rest like a page settling into place, we begin to sense the presence of something deeper beneath the polished surface of official history. Something older, quieter, and far more mysterious. Because controlling the narrative is only one part of the story. The other part lies in what was hidden beneath it. The suppressed accounts, the forbidden texts, the strange coincidences, the mysteries that refused to disappear, and the shadows that lingered even in the most carefully curated chronicle. So let us step softly now, transitioning gently into segment 3, where we explore the quiet mysteries that survive beneath the surface of official history, the anomalies, the contradictions, the forgotten voices, and the subtle hints of stories that were never meant to be found yet somehow endured. There is a gentle kind of mystery that rises whenever we step into the dim corridors of time. A soft, almost melancholic feeling that settles across the mind as we start to realize how much of humanity has slipped through the cracks, leaving only faint traces behind, like dust drifting in a quiet beam of light. And tonight, we follow that feeling into an older and quieter world. A world shaped not by what was recorded, but by what was allowed to disappear. Across the continents, long before the age of printing or the preservation of archives, civilizations rose and fell with rhythms as natural as the turning of the seasons. Cities flourished and then faded. Languages thrived and then dissolved. Knowledge blossomed and then folded into silence. And so much of it happened without ceremony, without witnesses, without a single intention to hide. Yet the result feels almost purposeful, as if history simply loosened its grasp and let countless stories drift away like forgotten whispers in the wind. Imagine yourself stepping into the remnants of these vanished worlds, the gentle echo of crumbling walls beneath your fingertips, the worn stones under your feet still holding a warmth left behind by centuries of sun, the soft hush of wind weaving through empty archways, where once voices gathered in bright conversation, and as you breathe in the faint scent of dust, age, and earth, you begin to sense how much life once passed through these forgotten spaces, how much memory the land still carries, even when the pages themselves have gone missing. Some of these disappearances were subtle, small cultures absorbed by expanding neighbors. Their stories slowly diluted until their names no longer held shape in the record, while others were sudden, brought on by drought, famine, fire, or disease that swept through quietly, leaving behind only the skeleton of a city and a silence where laughter and footsteps once lived. And because the world of the past had no guarantee of preservation, even the greatest centers of thought could fade away until only fragments remained, a scattering of broken pottery, a line or two in a foreign chronicle, a symbol whose meaning has been lost to the darkness of time. Consider the mysterious Indus Valley, where entire urban systems once pulsed with life, but left behind no deciphered script to speak on their behalf. Or the kingdom of Kush, whose pyramids still rise elegantly beneath the sun, yet whose rulers left only faint impressions scattered across stone and sand. Or the civilization of Norchico, whose quiet cities predated even the pyramids of Egypt, yet linger only as outlines traced in the earth. Without the stories that once filled them, standing among these ruins, you might feel a soft ache, a sense of how vast the silent portion of history truly is. How many songs were never written down? How many discoveries dissolved before they could travel? How many lives flickered brightly and then vanished without a single surviving word to mark their presence? But there is also a kind of calm beauty in this forgetting. A reminder that history is not only the grand narratives we study, but also the gentle fades, the soft dissolves, the anonymous rhythms of ordinary people moving through their days without any awareness that their stories would one day go quiet. And it is this quieter, softer side of the past that shapes the emotional tone of the present. The knowledge that we walk through a world built upon countless unseen foundations, and that every step we take echoes across landscapes once filled with life, but now resting in deep ancient slumber. As we breathe slowly with these vanished civilizations, allowing their quiet absence to settle peacefully into the mind, we prepare to move into our next Chapter 1, where the pages of history are not merely missing, but intentionally shaped, curated, and filtered. A world where what survives is not always an accident, but sometimes a choice. And so, when you're ready, let us drift gently toward segment 4, where we explore the keepers of history, the guardians of knowledge, and the subtle power that comes from deciding what is remembered and what fades into the dark. There are moments when we wander through the quiet corridors of history, when we begin to realize that the story of the world is not only shaped by the kings who commanded armies, or the empires that carved their borders across the earth, but also by the soft, steady hands of the people who coped the words, maintained the records, selected the manuscripts, and preserved the memories that were meant to survive. And in this segment, we drift into that quieter realm, a place where the fate of the past rested not on noise or violence, but on ink, parchment, shadows, and the quiet judgment of those who decided which parts of humanity deserved to remain illuminated. Imagine a dimly lit room, the kind where silence feels almost physical, where time seems to slow as the faint glow of candles spreads across stacks of manuscripts and scrolls resting patiently on wooden tables. The air carries the gentle scent of parchment-aged leather and ink that has dried over centuries, and somewhere in that stillness sits a lone scribe, his posture slightly curved, his breathing slow and steady, the quiet rhythm of his quill brushing softly against the page forming the heartbeat of the entire room. He is not a ruler, not a warrior, not a priest delivering proclamations from an altar. He is simply a guardian of memory, and yet, in the long arc of history, few wielded more influence than him. Because in a world where knowledge could disappear with a careless hand, a spilled lamp, a damp room, or a single generation of neglect, the scribes, chroniclers, and archivists were the ones who determined which stories crossed the fragile bridge of time, and which ones faded into silence. Picture him choosing his materials carefully, selecting the parchment with smooth edges. Dipping his quill into ink, he mixed himself that morning, adjusting the candle so that its flame casts a soft, steady glow across the desk. His job is to copy, to preserve, to continue the line of words that countless others before him had shaped. But with each decision he makes, each correction he chooses to omit or include, each passage he copies faithfully or improves for clarity, he is also reshaping the past. Not maliciously, not grandly, just softly, the way a river reshapes a stone over many years, through patient touch rather than force. And he is not alone. Across different cultures, in monasteries, hidden among mountains, in imperial courts, filled with scrolls, in temples where priests preserve sacred texts, and in early libraries where scholars gathered to discuss the meaning of ancient writings, similar figures perform the same quiet labor. Their hands move slowly. Their breath is steady. Their focus is deep, and their influence, to Gehentle, becomes enormous with time. It is tempting to imagine history as a long chain of facts, immutable, clear, identical through the centuries. But the reality is softer, more fragile, more human. Every time a manuscript was copied, a choice was made. Every time a chronicle was written, an interpretation was added. Every time a record was preserved, something else was left behind. And in this soft imbalance, the shape of memory changed. Travel now with your imagination to a monastery in medieval Europe, where monks sit in rows inside a scriptoria, their quills scratching lightly, their eyes moving between old manuscripts and fresh sheets of vellum. The room is cold, the stone walls absorbing what little warmth the candles provide, and yet the monks persist sometimes, for 10, 15, even 20 hours a day, copying texts, not because they expect the world to remember them, but because they know that if they don't, those words will be lost forever. Their rooms echo with a quiet hum of concentration, a shared silence that feels almost sacred. The monks sometimes correct grammar, modify phrasing, or simplify stories to make them easier to understand. Some add marginal notes, little reflections or interpretations that future readers will assume belong to the original author. Others deliberately soften passages, ensuring that the tone aligns with the beliefs of the community or the expectations of the church. And so, slowly, Gently, unintentionally, history shifts in another part of the world. Royal archivists in ancient China compile official dynastic histories. Meticulous, detailed, extensive, but even they cannot escape the soft weight of expectation. It is considered dishonorable to present a ruler in a negative light. It is considered proper to frame transitions between dynasties as part of a moral rhythm. The mandate of heaven shifting from one house to another, and over centuries, these conventions create a style, a pattern, a way of remembering that becomes almost indistinguishable from truth. Across the Mediterranean, scholars in Alexandria study scrolls from different cultures, comparing versions, choosing which manuscripts deserve copying, which ones will be prioritized, and which ones will simply age away on the back shelves. They do not always agree. They debate, they refine, they streamline, and slowly, the library itself becomes a filter, not only preserving texts, but shaping the flow of what the ancient world will later believe it knew. In the Islamic Golden Age, scribes living in Baghdad's House of Wisdom translate works from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Roman traditions, and with each translation, they face the same choices. Do they preserve the original exact phrasing? Do they adjust ideas to fit the culture they are writing for? Do they combine multiple sources to create a single, unified version of an older story? They choose as best they can, and once again, history subtly changes. Even in Africa and Timbuktu's desert libraries, scholars sift through manuscripts on astronomy, law, poetry, trade, geography, and philosophy, selecting those worth recopying into clean volumes that can survive another century or two. Their choices shape what we know of West African intellectual life today, and also what we will never be able to recover. All of these places, all of these people, all of these rooms filled with careful hands and quiet breaths, they are the true custodians of the past, and their influence is never loud. It is never forceful. It is never dramatic. It is a soft, steady current beneath the visible flow of time. But, of course, shaping what is preserved is only half the story. Because just as some stories were chosen to survive, others were quietly allowed to fade. Sometimes intentionally, often simply due to circumstance. And sometimes because the people copying the records did not fully understand the significance of what they were letting slip away. Imagine a manuscript set aside on a dusty shelf because it was deemed less important. Perhaps a collection of local stories, or a treatise on a small regional belief, or a diary of an ordinary person whose voice felt too simple to preserve. Imagine that manuscript resting there as decades pass, the ink slowly fading, the parchment becoming brittle, the edges curling inward, and then imagine a single moment. Perhaps a leak in the roof during a storm, or a fire that starts from a fallen candle or an insect burrowing into the corner. And the manuscript is gone forever, leaving behind only the faintest proof that it once existed. Multiply this story by millions, across centuries, across continents, and you begin to see how enormous the silent side of history truly is. And yet, even knowing this, there is something gentle and beautiful in the way the past has been shaped. It reminds us that history is not a fixed landscape, but a living memory. Fragile, evolving, influenced by quiet decisions made by people who lived through their days without ever knowing that future generations would depend on their care. Their soft choices built the foundation of what we now understand as human history. Their careful hands carried the stories that define civilizations. Their gentle omissions created the mysteries that scholars still chase today. And their patient work allowed the present world to inherit libraries of thought, belief, discovery, and imagination. Even now, in the age of digital archives, our understanding of the past rests heavily on the shoulders of these distant keepers, whose silent labor shaped not only what we know, but what we think we know. And as we breathe with this thought, letting it settle into the quiet spaces of the mind, we prepare to move into another part of this journey, one where the fragility of the physical world becomes more visible, where ruins and relics become the storytellers, and where time reveals itself as both a destroyer and a gentle preserver. Whenever you're ready, we drift softly toward segment 5, where we explore how history survives through objects, fragments, ruins, and the delicate remnants that time leaves behind. Sometimes, when we think about the story of history, we imagine kings and emperors standing at the center of the world. their commands etched into stone and the echoes of their voices rippling through centuries. But in truth, the survival of history, its real survival, has never depended on those crowned figures. It has depended on the quiet ones. The ones who worked at night, by candle flame, hunched over brittle manuscripts. The ones who crossed deserts with scrolls hidden under their cloaks. The ones who risked exile, punishment, or in some eras even death, simply because they believed that the past should remain intact. And so as we move deeper into history's deleted pages, we enter the world of the figures who rarely appear in any official records. The scholars, monks, translators, and archivists who tried to save the memories that powerful empires tried to destroy. And as we breathe slowly into this next chapter, imagine yourself slipping into a narrower corridor of time, one-lined, not with marble statues, but with dim rooms filled with dust, ink, and fragile stories that nearly slipped away forever. It begins in the ruins of Alexandria, not with flames or armies, but with the quiet aftermath. After centuries of conflict, political, religious, imperial, the Great Library, once the beating heart of ancient knowledge, was no more than a whisper carried down the Mediterranean coast. And yet, what most people never imagine is that pieces of Alexandria survived not because the empire protected them, but because scattered scholars took the fragments and hid them. They copied mathematical theorems onto scraps of papyrus. They translated medical texts into Arabic and Syriac. They carried small wooden boxers filled with scrolls through ports, across deserts, along riverbanks. The library may have burned, but its survivors, humble, unknown, and often unnamed, carried the light forward, preserving ideas that would have vanished into dust. And so the story of Segment 5 begins with this truth. History does not survive by accident. It survives because someone cared enough to save it. When we trace that thread forward, we arrive in the quiet chambers of medieval monasteries' long hallways, lined with stone arches, rooms dark except for the glow of lanterns reflecting off the golden edges of illuminated manuscripts. Inside these scriptoria, monks bent over ancient works copying Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Cicero, and anonymous poets, whose names we no longer know. They copied slowly, deliberately, often writing a single page over the course of several days. And in that time, they did something that rarely receives attention. They made choices about which texts deserved to be copied, and which were no longer considered necessary. Many works of ancient Greece and Rome survived only because a monk, somewhere between the 6th and 12th centuries, decided that the story was worth saving. Many others were lost simply because they were passed over and tucked between the letters of these manuscripts, sometimes in margins and sometimes in scraped-over are traces of the historians who worked in silence, little notes, faint corrections, or short comments that reveal the human hand behind the preservation of knowledge. This is hard to read, one monk wrote in the corner of a faded text. Pray for me, wrote another. Little glimpses of the lives behind the pages. But this story widens further when we move eastward, into the bustling intellectual world of the Islamic Golden Age. For centuries, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba became sanctuaries for knowledge that Europe had neglected or abandoned. Scholars gathered in the House of Wisdom, translating ancient Greek philosophy into Arabic, Persian, and Syriac. They didn't just preserve these works, they expanded them. They corrected mathematical equations, added new medical observations, challenged philosophical arguments, and wrote commentary that shaped how these works would be understood later when they were finally reintroduced into Europe during the Renaissance. Here, too, we find figures who tried to save what others had tried to erase. Translators like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who devoted his entire life to recovering lost Greek medical texts. Astronomers who rebuilt models of the night sky from damaged manuscripts, and historians who recorded events that their own rulers wished forgotten. Their work was not merely academic, it was an act of defiance against time itself. And still, the story of preservation takes another turn when we step into the era of expanding empires, when colonial powers swept across continents and began collecting manuscripts, artifacts, and oral histories from the cultures they encountered. Some preserved them in archives, but others destroyed the stories they could not control. And it was here, in the shadow of these overwhelming powers, that local scholars became guardians of memory. In West Africa, griots memorized entire lineages, so that foreign rule could not erase them. In Mesoamerica, Maya scribes hid codices in caves and wrapped them in cloth to protect them from burning. In Asia, wandering monks carried scrolls along the Silk Road long before borders existed, preserving small fragments of philosophy and poetry that might have otherwise vanished beneath war and political upheaval. These were protectors of knowledge who worked outside formal institutions, individuals whose names are mostly forgotten, yet whose work shapes what we know of ancient cultures today. And even in Europe during the most chaotic periods of war, famine, or plague, there were always individuals who continued copying manuscripts, storing them in cellars, hiding them beneath floorboards, or whispering their contents to apprentices. When ink became scarce, in some moments of crisis, entire libraries were smuggled out of cities at night, carried by scholars who were determined to keep history alive even as the world around them crumbled. It was during these dark ages that many chronicles, annals, and genealogies were preserved, not because they were valued, but because a single person believed they were worth saving. As we glide deeper, we also encounter the historians who did something even more fragile. They preserved stories that powerful institutions wanted erased. These were the chroniclers who recorded rebellions, forbidden beliefs, suppressed movements, or unpopular rulers. They preserved the names of ordinary people that official records ignored. They wrote about traditions, rituals, or legends that empires attempted to suppress. Many of their works were copied only once or twice, hidden in private archives or passed hand to hand like contraband. And many of these writers fully expected their work to be destroyed, but they wrote anyway, hoping that somewhere, someday, someone would read what had been silenced. And then, at last, we come to the modern era, where the preservation of history becomes a different kind of challenge. Instead of fire, war, or decay, the threat now comes from distortion, manipulation, or selective retelling. Modern scholars still fight to protect truth, digitizing ancient manuscripts, restoring damaged fragments, reassembling torn pages, and working to understand the texts that were once nearly destroyed. Archaeologists carefully excavate fragile remains. Linguists labor to reconstruct lost languages. Archivists sort through dusty boxers and basements where forgotten documents wait, and researchers trace the faintest clues of cultures that disappeared long before the modern age. It is a new kind of struggle, but the purpose is the same: to salvage the pieces of the past before they fade. As the narrative stretches forward, the identity of these scholars, monks, translators, and historians begins to dissolve into something more universal. They are not unique figures. They are reflections of a single, continuous lineage, a lineage of people who felt that the past mattered deeply enough to protect. And so, Segment 5 is a gentle reminder that history is not preserved by chance or stability. It survives because of human choice, human care, and human persistence. It lives today because someone, at some moment in time, reached out and held on to it. Now let your breath soften as we approach the next chapter. Because if these figures were the guardians who tried to save what history nearly lost, Segment 6 will bring us into an even deeper question, one that lies at the border between memory and disappearance. Something quieter, something more fragile, something almost spiritual. In the next segment, we'll explore what it truly means when whole civilizations vanish from the record, and what remains after the world forgets. There is a quiet hour in the long journey of history when the boundaries between memory and oblivion begin to blur, when the stories we think we know begin to dissolve into something gentler and harder to hold, as if time itself were a soft tide slowly pulling the edges of human experience back into the sea. And as we arrive here, at the final part of this wandering through what was erased, hidden, or simply lost, you may imagine yourself drifting along a wide plain of forgotten years, where the remnants of countless voices pass around you like faint echoes carried on a cool evening wind. It is here in this lonely and strangely comforting space between remembering and forgetting that we begin to understand how fragile the past truly is, how quietly it can slip away, and how even the most powerful civilizations, Rome with its stone columns, Babylon with its rising walls, China with its ancient courts, all eventually surrender parts of themselves to silence. Some things survive in carved tablets or crumbling manuscripts, but so much more disappears. Not in the dramatic flames of disaster, but in the gentler fade of time, where parchment dries, ink thins, and entire lives return to dust. And as we linger here in this final chapter, we can think of memory not as a rigid archive, but as a living place, breathing slowly, forgetting, slowly holding on to what it can, and releasing the rest. And when we look at history with that softness, we begin to see the beauty in what has been lost. Not only the sadness, because every forgotten name, every missing page, every faded mural reminds us that history is not a fixed thing carved in stone, but a shifting shape that we trace again and again, trying to understand the lives that came before us with the fragments they left behind. When archaeologists unearth a single clay tablet, the soft imprint of someone's hand still visible after thousands of years, they are not merely rescuing facts. They are protecting the fragile breath of a moment that almost vanished. A shopping list from an Egyptian marketplace, a child's handwriting in ancient Greece, a letter of affection hidden beneath the floorboards of a medieval home. These small artifacts carry the weight of memory, a memory that might easily have been erased by a rainstorm, a careless fire, or the passing of one generation. And when you consider that, you begin to sense the delicate balance between presence and absence that shapes our understanding of the past. For every artifact preserved, countless others were carried away by rivers, eaten by insects, buried beneath expanding cities, or simply worn down by the slow hands of weather. Entire languages vanished, leaving behind only whispers. Entire traditions disappeared, leaving behind only shadows. In Central Asia, caravans crossed the Silk Road, carrying songs and stories that lived for a single generation before dissolving into the desert wind. In the Americas, entire cities like Cahokia rose with thousands of people and then faded, leaving behind only earthen mounds that hold their secrets with quiet dignity. And in the Pacific Islands, once filled with complex oral histories, witnessed their tales drift away as migrations shifted. Storms arrived, and ancestors were remembered only faintly in songs. It is tempting to imagine this loss as something tragic, but if you listen more closely, you can sense another tone beneath it. Something calm, accepting, almost peaceful, because forgetting is not always destruction. Sometimes, it is simply the natural settling of time. The same way a river carries sediment downstream, reshaping the banks and gentle curves. History is full not only of erasures, but also of new stories that emerged because something older made space for them. Even within the Vatican archives we discussed earlier, or the royal repositories of ancient courts, or the sealed libraries beneath old temples, the presence of missing documents does not always suggest secrecy or suppression. Sometimes it simply reflects the slow rhythms of centuries, where scribes made choices, where custodians forgot, and where rooms full of manuscripts slowly decayed in humid summers or cold winters. The act of preservation is rare. The act of forgetting is constant, steady, patient. And yet, even as the past dissolves, people across eras have tried to resist the soft forgetting of time. Babylonian kings carved their victories in stone, believing the words would last forever. Though even stone erodes, medieval monks spent their entire lives copying manuscripts by hand, tracing each letter with quiet devotion, knowing that without their work, the voices of earlier centuries would fade into silence. Families in countless cultures passed down stories orally, from grandparent to child, and though the details inevitably shifted, the essence survived long enough to shape identities and memories. Still, no matter how much humanity tries to hold on, forgetting moves quietly through history like a slow mist, softening the sharp edges of what once was. It removes cruelty without erasing lessons. It dims glory without eliminating its influence, and it turns once vivid events into gentle stories that help us understand the world rather than overwhelm us. After enough centuries, even the greatest battles lose their violence and become simple lines in a chronicle. Even the most powerful rulers become shadows rearranged by memory. So, as we explore what was deleted from our past, perhaps the deeper question is not why things were forgotten, but what this forgetting teaches us. It teaches us humility, the recognition that even our present moment will someday be reduced to remnants. It teaches us appreciation for every artifact, every preserved page, every name we still remember. And it teaches us balance, to understand that what remains is enough to guide us, even if it is not complete. Imagine for a moment the countless people whose names never reached a scroll, a census, or a temple wall. Farmers tending fields under silent dawns, children laughing in narrow alleyways, travelers resting beside ancient wells. Their lives were full and meaningful, yet history did not record them, and still, their existence shaped the world in ways we cannot fully trace. Their invisible presence reminds us that forgetting does not erase influence. It only erases the trail. If you allow your mind to drift here, you may feel a gentle connection to those unknown lives, as if the quiet of the present moment allows a faint bridge across time. This is the soft mystery of forgetting, that sometimes, in losing details, we gain a broader sense of humanity, a deeper recognition of how universal our experiences truly are. The laughter, the sorrow, the hopes, the fears, all of them repeat across centuries, even when the names are gone. And as the narrative of this journey begins to lean toward its final moments, we can reflect on what it means to live in a world where so much of the past has faded. Rather than leaving us empty-handed, it invites us to look with more care at the fragments we do hold, the ruins left standing, the stories that survived in folklore, the languages we can still decipher, the art that preserved memories through imagery when words were lost. Each piece becomes more precious in the vast landscape of things that slipped away. In this gentle understanding, forgetting becomes not an enemy but a companion to memory, giving shape to what we know by contrasting it with what we do not. Just as night defines the boundary of day, forgetting defines the limits of our knowledge, encouraging curiosity, humility, and wonder. And as centuries continue to pass long after our own lifetimes, future generations will also look back at us, puzzled by the gaps, thoughtful about the silences, curious about what was deleted or never written down in the first place. And so as we close this segment, the quiet final chapter before the last reflection, allow yourself to settle into the soft rhythm of history. Ebb and flow, remembering that the past is not a fixed archive, but a living tapestry woven from both memory and forgetting, from what remains, and what dissolves from the stories we hold tightly, and the countless others that drift away. And now, as we gently move forward, we will take these reflections with us into the closing of our journey, where all the threads, what was lost, what was hidden, and what survived, come together in a single peaceful breath. And now, as we drift toward the end of this quiet journey through the hidden, the forgotten, and the softly erased corners of our shared past, you may notice the way your breathing has settled into a calm rhythm, slow and unhurried, as if your body itself has found a small refuge in the quiet spaces between these stories. And as if the world outside the room has faded just slightly, leaving you here wrapped in the gentle calm of the present moment. Across this long exploration, we have wandered through shadows and silences, through the delicate traces left by those who lived long before us, and through the gaps shaped by time, loss, and the quiet decisions of memory. And now, as all of these fragments settle like dust in a still room, you might feel a kind of soft gratitude for the stories that survived, for the ones that slipped away, and for the chance to rest for a while inside the gentle distance of history. Every forgotten page reminds us that life is brief but meaningful. Every missing voice reminds us that stillness has its place. And every erased detail reminds us that the world does not need to be complete to be beautiful. Tonight, as you drift between wakefulness and sleep, you carry with you the understanding that the past is not a rigid archive, but a gentle echo. A reminder that humanity across thousands of years has dreamed, worked, loved, and rested in rhythms not so different from your own. And in this quiet realization, perhaps you feel a soft looseness in your shoulders, a weight releasing from the center of your chest, a warmth settling somewhere behind your eyes. You are here now, in peace, moments safe, breathing, surrounded by the calm quiet of a world ready to let you sleep. And if you've enjoyed this slow and peaceful walk through history, if you'd like to join more journeys like this, soft, thoughtful, and crafted, for moments just like this one, you are gently invited to subscribe to the channel. Only if it feels right. Only if these quiet stories bring you comfort. And if you do, you will always have a place to return to whenever you want the world to slow down again. For now, allow the last remnants of our story to drift away like embers fading into the night, leaving only the sound of your own soft breaths, steady and serene. Let your mind settle. Let your thoughts loosen. Let sleep come to you naturally, like a tide moving toward the shore. Thank you for listening, and may your night be peaceful, your rests be deep, and your dreams be gentle. Good night.